In 1838, a fur trapper named Thomas Fitzpatrick walked into a trading post along the Platte River, carrying nothing but a knife and moccasins held together with bear fat. He had just crossed 400 miles of frozen wilderness alone. That was 1838. By 1950, the government had banned or publicly discouraged nearly every technique that kept him alive. Now, university labs are publishing study after study proving those mountain men were right all along. These are 7 banned mountain men survival tricks that scientists now say were genius. Number 7. Smoking meat over open fire. The Rocky Mountains in winter, 1825. A fur trapper kills an elk in the first week of November somewhere near the headwaters of the Green River in present-day Wyoming. He has no salt, no brine, no cellar or ice house, and no way to keep this meat from rotting before the next snowfall. What he does have is a fire pit and green wood from the nearest stand of hickory and alder. So he cuts the elk into thin strips, builds a crude rack of branches over the low flames, and lets the smoke do the work. For 3 days straight, the meat hangs in the haze. By the time he pulls it down, the strips are dry, dark, and infused with the smell of burned wood. They will last him through January. For thousands of years across every continent, this was how humans preserved meat. Smoke it low, smoke it slow, and it lasted for months without refrigeration, without chemicals, without anything except fire and patience. Mountain men and fur trappers across the American frontier relied on this method as their primary protein storage system through the brutal winters in the Rockies, the Cascades, and the Sierra Nevada range. This was their primary plan, the one everything else depended on. Then modern food science arrived and effectively killed the practice for the general public. Health authorities warned that traditional wood smoking was dangerous. They pointed to carcinogenic compounds called polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons that form during combustion, especially when fat drips onto hot coals. By the mid-20th century, commercial smoking was either heavily regulated or replaced entirely by chemical preservatives, sodium nitrite, and industrial refrigeration. The old way of hanging strips of venison over a campfire pit was treated like a relic. Something primitive people did because they did not have access to real preservation methods. Except those primitive people were onto something real. A study published in the journal Meat Science confirmed what the mountain men had been proving with their stomachs for generations. The phenols, carbonyls, and organic acids deposited by wood smoke onto the surface of meat are genuinely antimicrobial. They actively inhibit the growth of serious pathogens, including Listeria monocytogenes, Salmonella, pathogenic E. coli, and Staphylococcus. The smoke simultaneously dries the surface of the meat, reducing what food scientists call water activity, which is the measure of available moisture that bacteria need to reproduce. Reduce the water activity below a certain threshold, and microbial growth effectively stops. I mean, think about that for a second. Archaeologic findings show humans figured out this preservation method roughly 90,000 years ago. 90,000 years of successful food preservation, and the 20th century decided it was the generation that finally knew better. Number 6. Filtering water through campfire charcoal. If a mountain man needed drinking water and the nearest stream looked murky or stagnant, he did not pack up camp and walk 10 miles, hoping to find something clearer. He reached into the fire pit, grabbed a handful of burned-out charcoal, crushed it into a coarse powder, and layered it inside a cone of birch bark or a hollow section of log. Underneath the charcoal, he packed fine sand, then a layer of small pebbles at the bottom to keep everything from washing through. He poured the dirty water in the top and collected what dripped out the bottom. What came through was visibly clearer. Not perfect, not sterile, but dramatically better than what went in. Government wilderness agencies and public health officials spent decades telling people not to do this, and they were partially right. Regular campfire charcoal is not the same as commercially produced activated charcoal, and it will not reliably remove every virus, bacterium, or dissolved chemical from untreated water. That is a fair and important distinction. But here is the thing they skipped over in making that point. The underlying principle, using porous carbon as a filtration medium to absorb contaminants from water, turns out to be the exact same science behind every Brita filter sitting on a kitchen counter right now, behind every granular activated carbon system in municipal water treatment plants, and behind the carbon filtration modules used on the International Space Station to recycle astronaut drinking water. The reason it works comes down to surface area. 1 gram of activated charcoal has an internal surface area of over 500 square meters. That is roughly the floor space of a large house, folded into a piece of carbon you could fit on your fingernail. Even regular campfire charcoal, while significantly less porous than the industrial version, still has enough surface area to absorb sediment, many organic compounds, and some dissolved chemicals. Add layers of sand to catch larger suspended particles and gravel to prevent the whole system from clogging, and you have a functional multi-stage filtration system. Mountain men were building these out of dead trees and campfire remnants 200 years before anyone put a carbon filter in a plastic pitcher and called it innovation. And those mountain men used charcoal for more than just water. They rubbed it on wounds as a crude antiseptic and mixed it into remedies for stomach ailments, which modern medicine now recognizes as the principle behind activated charcoal tablets used in emergency rooms to treat certain types of poisoning and drug overdoses. John Coulter, the famous explorer who traveled over 1,000 miles of wilderness on foot between 1807 and 1808, carried nothing but a 30-pound pack through the dead of winter in what is now Yellowstone country. Clean water was a daily problem, and improvised charcoal filtration was one of the tools that kept him hydrated and moving through territory no European had ever crossed. Hardly anyone talks about this part of frontier life, but the next trick on this list is the kind of thing that gets you strange looks even at a modern survival camp. Number 5. Rubbing animal fat on exposed skin. Picture a February morning somewhere in the Wind River Range of Wyoming. The air temperature is hovering around -30 degrees Fahrenheit. The wind is coming down off the peaks hard enough to drive ice crystals through fabric. A mountain man crawls out of his buffalo hide shelter, reaches into a leather pouch, scoops out a handful of rendered bear grease, and smears it across every inch of exposed skin on his face, neck, and hands. Then he works another layer into his thin leather moccasins, his leggings, and the stitching on his capote. He has been doing this every single morning since October. He will keep doing it until April. To a modern observer, this looks absurd. It looks like superstition, or at best, a crude folk remedy with no scientific basis. 20th century health and hygiene experts certainly treated it that way. Rubbing animal fat on your skin was seen as a dirty habit from a dirtier era, something people stopped doing as soon as they had access to proper winter clothing. The biology disagrees. Fat tissue is one of the most effective thermal insulators in the entire animal kingdom. Adipose tissue, the scientific term for body fat, has a characteristically low thermal conductivity, meaning it strongly resists the transfer of heat. This is the exact same principle behind blubber in whales, seals, and walruses. That thick layer of subcutaneous fat allows marine mammals to survive and even thrive in ocean temperatures that would kill an unprotected human in under 15 minutes. When mountain men rubbed tallow or bear grease on their skin, they were applying a temporary external layer of insulation that slowed heat loss from the body's surface, working on the same physical principle as blubber, just applied from the outside rather than grown from within. And the moccasin trick was equally sound from a chemistry standpoint. Animal fat is hydrophobic, meaning its molecular structure naturally repels water. Smearing a thick coat of rendered fat over the stitching and exposed seams of leather boots creates a water-resistant barrier that prevents snowmelt, slush, and creek water from soaking through the material. Mountain men, hunters, and trappers across the entire American frontier use this technique daily to keep their feet dry through conditions that would soak through and destroy a pair of modern hiking boots in about a week. The fat also kept the leather supple in freezing temperatures, preventing the cracking that turns footwear into a liability in deep cold. Nobody explained thermal conductivity or hydrophobic molecular bonding to these men. They just paid close attention to what kept them alive and what got them killed: And what they landed on turns out to be textbook physics and chemistry. Number 4. Pemmican. This is the one. If you only remember a single item from this entire video, make it this, because it might be the most underrated food ever invented. Pemmican was the original energy bar, invented by the indigenous peoples of the North American Great Plains and adopted wholesale by mountain men, fur traders, voyageurs, and every serious expedition that crossed the continent throughout the 1800s. The recipe is dead simple, almost suspiciously so. Take lean meat, usually bison or elk, and dry it until the strips are so brittle they snap instead of bend. Then pound the dried meat into a fine powder. Melt down rendered animal fat, the hard white tallow from around the kidneys and internal organs, until it is liquid. Pour the hot fat over the meat powder and mix it thoroughly. Some versions added dried berries, chokecherries, and Saskatoon berries being the most common. Shape the mixture into dense loaves, cut into bars or patties, and let it cool and solidify. That is the entire process. No preservatives, no refrigeration, and no specialized equipment of any kind. And this food, made from 3 ingredients in a campfire pot, could last for years without spoiling. Some accounts put the shelf life at over a decade when stored properly. Modern nutrition science dismissed pemmican for most of the 20th century, and the reason comes down to one ingredient: fat. The anti-animal fat movement that dominated Western dietary advice from the 1960s through the early 2000s treated rendered tallow as essentially a heart attack in solid form. Saturated fat was the villain. Low-fat, high-carbohydrate diets were the answer. Anything that was not lean, packaged, and approved by the food pyramid was considered nutritionally irresponsible at best and actively dangerous at worst. Pemmican, with its roughly 50-50 blend of protein and animal fat by weight, was the direct opposite of everything the dietary establishment told you to eat. If you are finding this helpful, hit subscribe. I cover forgotten history like this every week. So what did the science actually say when someone finally tested it properly? According to the USDA National Nutrient Database, dried beef alone delivers roughly 50 grams of protein per 100 grams. When combined with rendered animal fat, pemmican provides between 3,000 and 4,000 calories per pound. That is more than a full day's worth of calories in a package weighing less than half a kilogram. The reason is simple arithmetic that the low-fat era chose to ignore. Fat delivers 9 calories per gram, compared to just 4 calories per gram from protein or carbohydrates. In environments where every ounce of weight matters, where you are hauling supplies on foot through mountain passes or by canoe across the Canadian Shield, that caloric density becomes the margin between making it to the next supply point and dying on the trail. The berries were not just for flavor either. Dried berries mixed into the rendered fat provided vitamin C, which prevented scurvy, the disease that killed more sailors, soldiers, and explorers throughout history than combat ever did. The fat encapsulation actually protected the vitamin from degradation, keeping it bioavailable even after months of storage without any form of refrigeration. One expedition journal documented a man subsisting entirely on pemmican for 5 weeks during a 100-mile snowshoe trek through the boundary waters of northern Minnesota. He completed the trip in good health. If you are wondering how that is even possible, so is everyone else. Every modern energy bar, every military MRE, every freeze-dried camping meal owes its basic concept to a recipe that fur trappers carried in their saddlebags across the Rocky Mountains. And most of those modern alternatives still cannot match pemmican on caloric density, shelf life, or sheer simplicity of production. The very ingredient that makes pemmican work, animal fat, was the exact ingredient the modern food establishment spent 6 decades telling you to avoid. Number 3. Burying food underground. Mountain men and frontier trappers did not have root cellars. Many of them did not even have permanent shelters. They were nomadic by necessity, following the beaver and the elk and the trade routes through country that had no roads, no towns, and no infrastructure of any kind. When a trapper needed to store a season's worth of dried meat, cured hides, or trade goods for several months while he worked another stretch of territory, he used a technique called a cache. He dug a hole in the ground, typically bottle-shaped, so it was wider at the bottom than the opening, and deep enough to clear the frost line. He lined the interior with dry branches and bark, keeping moisture away from the contents. Then he wrapped his goods in animal hide, placed them carefully inside without letting anything touch the walls, and layered in more dry branches as insulation. On top, he placed a treated skin, covered everything with the original soil, and packed it flat. The final step was replacing the original grass or ground cover so the cache was completely invisible. Manuel Lisa, one of the founders of the Missouri Fur Company, used this system across the territories of present-day Missouri and Kansas. Trappers could leave a cache buried for a full season, sometimes longer, and return to find their dried foodstuffs and pelts unspoiled. Modern food safety authorities dismissed underground caching as crude, unsanitary, and unreliable. They pointed to the risks of rodent damage, moisture intrusion, and bacterial contamination. And for improperly prepared perishable foods, that criticism was legitimate. But the core principle behind the cache is not crude at all. Below a certain depth, ground temperature stabilizes between roughly 50 and 55 degrees Fahrenheit, regardless of what is happening on the surface. Whether it is 100 degrees in August or -20 in January, the temperature 6 feet underground barely moves. The Earth is a massive natural insulator. For dried, low-moisture foods that have already been preserved through smoking, salting, or sun-drying, this creates ideal long-term storage conditions. Cool enough to dramatically slow any remaining bacterial activity, stable enough to avoid the destructive freeze-thaw cycles that ruin preserved food when stored above ground, consistent enough to maintain quality for months or even years. The same principle now drives the design of modern root cellars, commercial wine caves, and even certain data center cooling systems that use the Earth's thermal mass to regulate temperature without electricity. Burying food below the frost line for temperature regulation turns out to be applied thermodynamics, practiced successfully for centuries before anyone gave it a name. The mountain men even understood the importance of the bottle-shaped design, wider at the bottom to maximize storage and narrow at the top to minimize the opening exposed to weather and animals. They were engineering their own underground refrigerators using nothing but a shovel, animal hides, and a working knowledge of how the earth holds temperature. Number 2. Chewing willow bark for pain and fever. A mountain man takes a bad fall from a granite ledge somewhere in the Bitterroot Mountains of present-day Montana. He lands on his right arm and hears the bone crack. There is no doctor within 200 miles, no laudanum, no morphine, nothing in the way of medical supplies beyond a few strips of cloth for bandaging. What he does is drag himself to the nearest riverbank, find a willow tree, strip a section of bark from a low-hanging branch, and chew on it. He chews until the bitter taste fills his mouth and the sharpest edge of the pain starts to dull. Then he sets the broken bone himself, splints it with 2 straight sticks and rawhide, and keeps moving. This was standard frontier medicine, practiced by mountain men, trappers, and indigenous peoples across North America for generations. They learned it from observation, from trial and error, and from knowledge passed between cultures at trading posts and winter camps. No medical degree and no pharmacology textbook. Just the hard-won understanding that when you chewed the bark of a willow tree, the pain got quieter and the fever dropped. The medical establishment of the 19th and 20th centuries treated this as folk medicine. Quaint, maybe, but certainly not scientific. By the time pharmaceutical aspirin hit drugstore shelves in 1899, courtesy of the Bayer Company in Germany, willow bark was considered irrelevant. Why chew on a tree when you can swallow a standardized tablet? But willow bark contains a compound called salicin. When your body metabolizes salicin, it converts the molecule into salicylic acid, which is the direct chemical precursor to acetylsalicylic acid, the compound we now call aspirin. The mountain men were not using some vague alternative to aspirin. They were using the original biological source of the drug, the one that grows on trees along virtually every river and creek in North America. The medicinal use of willow bark stretches back more than 3,500 years. Ancient Sumerian tablets mention willow as a treatment for pain. Hippocrates recommended it in the 4th century BC. An English clergyman named Edward Stone conducted one of the first real clinical investigations of dried willow bark in the 1700s, using it to treat fevers for 5 years. By 1826, Italian researchers had isolated salicin directly from willow bark, and a German pharmacologist had purified and named it. A warning sign sat in the science this entire time. A modern clinical trial published in the American Journal of Medicine tested willow bark extract on patients with chronic low back pain. After 4 weeks, 39% of the high salicin group were completely pain-free, compared to 21% of the low salicin group and just 6% of the placebo group. That is not a marginal result. That is a drug-grade clinical outcome from a piece of tree bark. And yet, the knowledge that ordinary frontiersmen had been self-medicating effectively with raw bark for centuries was treated as a historical footnote, never as evidence that these men understood something real and useful about the natural world surrounding them. Number 1. Eating the inner bark of pine trees. This is the one that makes even experienced modern survivalists cringe, and it is also the one with the most scientific evidence behind it. When a mountain man ran out of food in the dead of winter, when the elk and the deer had denned up in valleys he could not reach, when the snowdrifts were taller than a man on horseback, and no hunting party on snowshoes could cover enough ground to find game, he turned to the nearest pine tree. He cut through the rough, gray outer bark with his knife, peeled it away in sections, and scraped off the soft, pale inner layer underneath. This layer is called the cambium, and it is a living part of the tree that sits between the outer bark and the wood itself. It is white or cream-colored with a rubbery texture, and it does not look like food. Then he ate it, sometimes raw, stripped right off the trunk, sometimes dried and pounded into a coarse flour that could be mixed with water and baked into a flatbread over hot stones, sometimes boiled into a thin, bland porridge. None of these preparations tasted good. The bark was chewy, fibrous, occasionally bitter with pine resin, and required a serious jaw workout to get down. But it kept him alive through stretches when nothing else was available. For most of the 20th century, eating tree bark was considered an act of absolute desperation. Survival manuals included it grudgingly, if they mentioned it at all, usually with disclaimers suggesting that the calories were negligible and the experience barely worth the effort. Nutrition experts dismissed the practice as essentially worthless. You might as well eat cardboard, they said. You would get about the same nutritional value. Then researchers from multiple universities and government forestry departments actually ran the numbers. The inner bark of a pine tree, the cambium layer, contains between 500 and 600 calories per pound. That is not trivial. That is a meaningful caloric load, roughly comparable to many commercial breads. The cambium contains digestible starches, natural sugars, vitamins, including vitamin C, minerals, and a large amount of dietary fiber. One biochemist calculated that pine bark flour contains approximately 82 kilocalories per 100 grams, which places it in the same general caloric range as many root vegetables. An entire tribe in the mountains of upstate New York built their identity around this practice. The Adirondacks, a Native American people who thrived in what is now northern New York State, got their name from it. The word Adirondack translates from the Iroquois language to bark eaters. That name was a straightforward description of how they survived. These people survived the harshest winters in the Northeast by harvesting and eating the inner bark of pine trees when snow buried every other food source. Pine bark bread has been baked in Sweden and Finland for centuries, made from rye flour mixed with toasted and ground inner bark. The tradition never disappeared in Scandinavia, where long winters and limited growing seasons made tree bark a practical part of the diet. It disappeared in America because the 20th century decided that anything a mountain man ate out of sheer necessity could not possibly have real nutritional value. Meanwhile, the pharmaceutical and supplement industries now sell pine bark extract, commercially branded as pycnogenol, as a premium dietary supplement. Published clinical studies have explored its anti-inflammatory properties, its potential effects on blood sugar regulation, and its possible benefits for cardiovascular and gastrointestinal health. The very substance that survival guides dismissed as a starvation food is now sold in capsule form at health food stores for $30 a bottle. So not great for the experts who spent decades calling it worthless. The real question is not whether mountain men knew what they were doing. The evidence makes that pretty clear. The real question is what else we threw away because the people who invented it did not have a laboratory. Every technique on this list follows the exact same pattern. Somebody invented it out of necessity, refined it through brutal experience over generations, watched the modern world dismiss it as primitive, and then watched again as the scientific establishment quietly, sometimes sheepishly, confirmed it was right. These men did not have peer-reviewed journals or research funding. They had the Rocky Mountains, a skinning knife, and the understanding that if something kept you alive through a winter at 12,000 feet above sea level, it was worth passing on. If you want to see what other forgotten survival methods the modern world is just now catching up to, that video is on screen right now.